So my talk is about your operating system as a design problem. And this is something I've been thinking a lot about. And I think that the connection to what we're talking about today for some of the more quote unquote technical talks will become apparent as we move through. So stick with me and let's jump in. As Otto mentioned, just important for today, my background is primarily in product management and UX research. And for the last 10 years, have been pretty heavy in B2B software as a service. So I haven't been doing hardware. I haven't been in a massive B2C type company. So that's a little bit of my context. And right now I'm the head of product at a company called .work. We won't talk too much about that. We're going to focus on this stuff today. But if you're interested, you can reach out. And I'm the author of the Beautiful Mess newsletter, which I write every week. And I love writing. And that's probably how I met Otto in the beginning, is I probably wrote something and that's how we connected. Feel free to contact me in any of these ways. So I'll start off today's talk with a brief story. It's a story in 3 parts. I'm going to give you 3 fun little tidbits from my career. This was my passion project. I was working at a company and I dutifully printed magnets for every team member. And I arranged this and I brought people to this particular board, and it had so much love put into it. I made little templates for 1-pagers, and actually people liked it within the front line liked it within the company. This will be a theme that you'll see throughout. And everything was going well until a senior leader came and actually physically tore it down. And the reason why they tore it down, I later learned, was that it defied some sort of core idea they had about how the culture should be working. And they had gotten particularly mad when they had seen a certain engineer in front of it proposing something that they didn't think was the right thing to propose at that time. They thought this was too process driven. And so I had basically tempted the eye of Sauron, and they descended upon this particular board. So that's story number 1. Story number 2 is I ran a small experiment where I found correspondents on each team to write a tiny short update from their team, because we were a growing company and it was important to just be generally aware of what people were working on, but you didn't want like a performative status check or anything. And so I tested it, and the correspondents wrote it, and we did it every 2 weeks. And I remember one point where the CTO walks out of his office. We only PDF'd it, by the way. And he said, "Cutler, this is genius. This is the only way I'm getting the vibe of the whole company. Thank you so much." And it actually lasted for years. People would send me emails from this company and say, "Look what you started. It's been a great year." And this was called Team from the Front Lines of all the so curious, right? Like, okay, so this experiment worked, at least for a while, many years actually. And I'll give you one final story. At a recent job, I coined this term, big messy projects, BMPs. And something very curious happened. The frontline folks, again, said that this captured a certain pain that they were experiencing that was very hard to describe, and they were extremely happy that I had coined this idea. What was I doing? I mean, I coined a word within the company, created it, and this had a different result. It attracted both of them. So some people loved it, but again, it attracted the eye of Sauron. What does messy mean? Messy sounds bad. We can't have messy, but is it messy or very messy? Or why is that a BMP and this is not a BMP? And meanwhile, the front lines were still very appreciative of it. And you'll see why these stories come in. But basically, for the last, I don't know how many years, it's been 10 years now, I've run countless sort of ways of working experiments, operating system experiments. And I have the stories to tell. Most of these things don't work, by the way, but some of them do. And this is kind of the basis for my talk today, is sort of how we design these things. So stepping up from a level from developer productivity to just how we work as an organization. Just a little bit about .work now. This might have been a bad idea because it might make my head completely explode, but I basically spend hours every day chatting with people who are essentially designing and or tooling various sort of operating systems in their company. Might have been a mistake because my head explodes on a daily basis. But anyway, this is where we're at. So first, before we jump in, confusing words proceed with caution here at this point. I'm just going to use the word operating system for now. I haven't really found much better. But when I say operating system, I'm talking about rituals, norms, the artifacts you use, the principles you have, the cycles you choose, roles and responsibilities, kind of how you set goals, your norms, your feedback loops. For today, I'm just going to call it operating system. I know OS carries a lot of heavy weight, but just stick with it for now. Proceed with caution, confusing words. We could call it operating environment, org design, ways of working. For today, we're just going to call it operating system, and let's go. So in the last 10 odd weeks of this job, I started it in December. I've chatted with hundreds of product and engineering leaders, 100 plus. I guess that's not hundreds. My brain is completely filled with this stuff, and that's why I was so passionate to talk about it today. But suffice to say, I've collected tons of stories about frustration, about things that worked, about designing these systems, about failure and success. So my brain is full with this stuff, and I'm going to share a little bit of this stuff with you today. So one of the things that became very apparent when I was doing these interviews was that even talking about this can be problematic. So on one end of the spectrum, I'm just using GitLab as an example. Maybe someone's from GitLab in the audience. You have companies that have written 2,000-page handbooks about how they work. These are some artifacts that I've collected in my research, but there are some people who love to think and talk about this stuff and write it down and make it clear. And on the other side, you have companies that literally believe that writing anything down means it will not work. We just figure it out. This is how we work. So one of the things that was fascinating in this research about talking about how you work is, well, you can find high-performing organizations on both sides of this, and you can find terrible places to work and not terribly high-performing organizations on both sides of this particular thing. So even talking about your design of how you work can be problematic. Now, remember that picture I showed you of the Kanban board that attracted the eye of Sauron? That was the naive John that thought, well, if we're just going to make it transparent and visible, who could argue with that? Who could argue with making the work visible or writing something down? Well, it turns out lots of people can argue with doing that. But in my research with different leaders, what they often navigate is this environment of how people even talk about these things. A great quote is that, one person had been in a company and they talked about hallway conversations about heavy topics like centralization or decentralization or the limits of alignment, how we worked, the culture of how you work. And at their current company, no one was interested at all. And in fact, it was actively frowned upon. It was talking about work instead of working. How fascinating is that? That simply the culture around thinking about this can be so vastly different between different companies. Also in this research, I've obviously kind of made these quotes a little bit synthetic, was surfacing how beliefs about humans and how we operate can have profound influence on how companies even think about designing their operating system or how it's working. So if you think that humans are flawed but controllable through structure, incentives, and oversight, which is kind of in the nutshell what someone told me, well, you're going to take a very different approach to designing your operating system. If you think that humans seek mastery, purpose, and pride in their work, and they want to get better, and they want to pass that knowledge to others, well, that will influence your design decisions. If you believe that humans reveal their worth when pushed to their limits, if they break, they weren't meant to be here, well, goodness, that will very much influence. That is at one of the companies that generally people consider to be one of the highest performing companies in the world. And actually the strategy is just cook people. They'll stay there long enough. They're geniuses anyway. See how long they last. If they last 2 years, great. 3 years, great. 4 years, they'll vest, but we're going to get the best out of them. That's really, really heavy. But anyway, people's views about humans and how they operate have profound influences on the design of their operating system. And this showed up in countless interviews that I've been doing. Another thing that's really incredible is just how companies perceive process or perceive these things as process. There are some companies where anything that is written down or codified or explained is at best viewed as a necessary evil. And there are other companies that literally believe that how they have designed their operating system is not just a mere process. It's literally a unique differentiator for their company in the market. They believe that they wouldn't have their market position if they hadn't evolved an operating system internally the way they have. So one thing that comes up in a lot of these conversations, and then also indirectly, so let's say I'm talking to a change agent and then they have to talk about this stuff within their company, is the challenges they have about preconceptions about what a process means. Is a good meeting a process, or is a process only a TPS report? And if you know what a TPS report is. This is a fascinating thing that comes up again and again in these conversations. The next thing is that generally there's many perceptions that sort of an active, deliberate, intentional design of how you work. This is, if you're familiar with the Westrom topology of companies, I've sort of adapted this to think about what it means for operating system design. So in some settings, the people who are quote unquote designing the system are taking just a highly pathological approach to what they're doing. It's manipulative. There's a fair amount of behavior control, surveillance. There's emotional manipulation in how the companies run. Now, if you've worked at a company that took a pathological approach to operating system design, there's no surprise why you believe that process is something to be heavily avoided, because you're scarred by that approach to thinking about operating system design. Now, if you've worked in a more process-centric or company as machine type model, and if it was over-engineered and you weren't really a part of what was happening and it was one size fits all, you were just seen as kind of a variable in this whole process. It was very bureaucratic. You'll also take away that very process-centric stigma around how this is done. But what I'd like to propose is that in chatting with these folks, you meet people who are taking what I would call a generative approach. It's intentional. It involves other people. There's participatory design of how you're working. There's an acknowledgement of this being sort of a human factors exercise. There's a desire for coherence and shared understanding. It's context aware, it's emergent. There's all these good things. So that's another fascinating thing I learned, is the stigmas around process, the stigmas around ways of working in people's prior environments, whether they be highly pathological or highly process centric, also heavily influences and drives, for example, if a leader, a founder started their current company and their last company was highly pathological when it came to ways of working, they will essentially reject certain ideas just on face value because of their prior experience. It's really, really important to consider. But I'd like to propose, when I see the results of certain leaders, that there is this sort of friendly, collaborative, participatory design element to ways of working. And the analogies I use here is that, think about what makes a good game. There's kind of game design. There are attainable goals. There's a balance of difficulty. There's incremental progress. There's a compelling environment. There's social interactions, accessibility. Well, if people can design great games, there surely must be some things we can do to make our environments compelling and interesting. Another example, and this is probably the problem of the virtual element of software work in general, is if you walk into if you've ever done music recording, or if you've ever been part of a crafter or maker space or anything like that, there's simply better designed environments for creativity. If we think about it from a physical perspective, the tools are there, the sound volume is correct, right? It's a comfortable place to work. Similarly, if you've been in an environment where you get the context you need to do great work, you understand the strategy of the company, you understand the goals of the company, you understand the language, at least a light amount of common language between the different parts of the company, we've all felt that there is something there that is better than in the environments that weren't a great game or weren't a great workspace or didn't have the context you need. The point I'm trying to make here is that although it's hard to put a name to what I'm talking about, we know that there is better situations and worse situations, and some amount of intentionality has gone on behind the scenes to make it a great place to work and to have great results for customers. The problem, I think, is that when I talk about this as a design problem, the palette is massive, is expansive, right? I mean, you've got relationships and limits and boundaries and org design and structure. This is a pretty heady area to think about. I mean, organizational design tends to be like this. The fact that in some companies, simply naming things a bet had a profound influence on how the company worked, that's super weird. And so my point here is that when you chat with folks and you see the words they use and their sort of design levers or their palette for how they're thinking about their company to be successful, it's pretty expansive, and it can be a little bit overwhelming. And so we'll get into some of the key things and maybe take some questions after that. So the question is, hopefully I've persuaded you that something is happening behind the scenes. It's not as simple as we think. It might not be explicit in one company. It might be way more implicit in another company. There's a wide palette. Culture matters. You can't just copy and paste what Spotify did. You can't just copy and paste or whoever did. But it's something. We've all felt it, and there's some amount of intentionality that creates the results that we want. So the question is where you start. So one of the key learnings in chatting with folks is that not all leaders or not all managers or not all operations people or not all whoever domain experts are good at this. This seems self-evident, but it is amazing how many leaders think, well, I'm the leader of the company, I must be good at organizational design. No. There are many highly successful leaders who have been great product managers or engineering leaders, and in fact were great frontline managers, and they started a company, and they don't really have a systems thinking bone in their body. And I'm not saying that in a negative way. I'm just saying that what makes them amazing at what they're doing is probably the opposite of the skills necessary to be good at this particular thing. They don't think about ecosystem design. They don't think about platform thinking. They don't think about the psychological element or the socio-technical element of this. Many people do, but not all do. Similarly, you can be a great product manager or a great engineering manager or an engineering leader or whoever. And what you do locally that works, that makes you successful as an engineering manager or a product manager, et cetera, simply doesn't apply when you're dealing with this ecosystem across a whole company. So you see a lot of people take approaches that worked with their local teams. For example, we're going to agree on what words mean here. We're going to just agree on when we show up and have our meetings. If you take that to the highest level and you apply it haphazardly, you can get not great results. But I think that this is somewhat liberating, because if, for example, this talk is confusing you, you just might not have spent a lot of time learning about these things. And that's an opportunity to learn. And that might also be an opportunity if you work with other people or you're managing people to be like, you're really good at lots of things, but you're not necessarily great at this thing. And that's okay. The second thing is that there is a profound effect that happens with the IKEA effect in organizations. And this was sort of borne out in the research that I've done, which is it is not a prerequisite for doing well. There's certainly some companies that are so sick of this talk and it's all processed to them. They just pick whatever framework, we'll just do that thing and then we'll just do it by the book and we'll be okay. There are some companies successful doing that. But the companies that are able to foster an environment where this is seen as a participatory design problem, the IKEA effect is basically if you put it together, you'll take some certain level of pride in having put it together, even if you're just assembling pieces for doing it. So the number of situations where 90% of a company's operating system was similar to the next company, but they had put such interesting, thoughtful twists, either on the naming of things. One company was very adamant about calling their strategy development process a campaign. And they came up with a word that some things are campaigns, some things are, I forget what it was, some things are campaigns, some things are games, some things are whatever. Just those three little things, integrating that little twist into what they were doing, had a profound influence on the company. So this is important. If you somehow feel that these sort of protracted discussions about, if you think to yourself, well, for Christ's sakes, we can't reinvent the wheel here. I mean, this is a solved problem. There is an absolute value to attempting to solve the problem again, if anything, because it brings people into the fold and it allows you to stamp something unique in the culture that you're doing. The next set of skills that I would encourage you to explore, and it seems like the people who are really good at this, whether or not they are formal designers or formal service designers or formal ecosystem designers, whatever we want to call it, is that there is a deep appreciation for the fact that you have to think about this in terms of, I was just going to call it a service design problem. You have activities that people need to do, decisions, interactions, behaviors. You have the people involved, the actors. You have the various rituals that are involved in making that happen. You have the various documents they use, the workflows they use. And so when a leader, shows up and with a pyramid from strategy to execution and says, this is how we work, that's just such an oversimplified awareness of what's going on in the company. So the thing to explore, if you're listening and if you're curious about all this, is the world of service design and the world of sort of ecosystem design is really filled with this type of thinking, to think about this as a layered thing. Who or what is involved? What are they doing? How do groups come together? What helps them do their work? What information is needing? What guides decision-making? And if you can embrace this type of thinking, it makes the design of some of these quote unquote processes much more collaborative and much more long lasting in the company. The fourth thing, where do you get started, is that I think if I say the word behavior design to most people, they're thinking about, the hooked model or BJ Fogg. They're thinking about people building apps that are attempting to use dark patterns to get people to do things. Put that stuff all to the side. There's a great book called Talk to the Elephant by Julie Dirksen, which talks about there is a thing called behavior design in medicine, in communities. And it is the idea that what we really, really can think about are what are the behaviors and interactions happening between the people. I'm amazed at how many times I go to a leader and the leader says, we need empowered teams. And I say, what behaviors would I observe right in front of me, like moving atoms, not the words you're using, but moving atoms? What behaviors would I observe if that was happening? And then they proceed to parrot a paragraph from a Marty Kagan book or whoever and says, that's what I would see would happen. It's apparent to me when I hear that happen that they've never seen it happen themselves, and they actually just won't know it until they see it, right? They have a tough time converting these high-minded ideas to the actual behaviors that exist. So behavior design is a huge topic, but one of the basic ideas is that knowledge or training or skills are typically a small part of the problem. You have lack of feedback, unclear goals, how to unlearn existing behaviors, the need for social proof, the lack of autonomy and ownership. These are all very heavily researched ideas in behavior design. And it lets you, in this quick example, I show how, for example, a team that wanted to be more data informed. What leader hasn't said, we want to be more data informed? Well, you hear it all the time, but when you ask them for the actual behaviors of what being data informed would look like, they're at a loss. Well, This thinks about the behaviors and then says, what are the key interventions that we might use? Focusing on follow-up system, which is an important part of behavior, short targeted training if it's needed to get over the hops, and normalizing mistakes and creating an open dialogue. All this stuff are very powerful interventions that you can take. So the behavior design world is a great place to start. I think that one thing for folks who are deep in the engineering or product space who feel intimidated by this, often I just do a quick exercise with them. And this is related a little bit to team topologies or the idea of cognitive load, et cetera, is that I ask them about the nature of the work. You know, is this work more transactional or supporting or collaborative? And how are we being forced to approach the work at the moment? So for example, you see in this chart, the little gray boxes going left to right. In a perfect world, you would treat collaborative work in environments that supported being collaborative. However, sometimes one of the problems that happens in companies is the things that you need to do collaboratively, you're being forced to do transactionally. And the things that you're forced to do transactionally, you're being forced to do collaboratively. For Christ's sakes, I just need access to that system. This is a transactional request. Oh, we have to have 7 meetings about it. That's the example of transactional work that'd be collaborative. The opposite is, oh, by the way, these 3 teams need to work together for this really important mission. Oh, great. We'll have 7 layers of management do proxy conversations in 72 hours of meetings back and forth to try to transactionalize what could be a collaborative relationship. So the point I'm making here is if all this seems intimidating, and what you have as a product manager, engineering manager is an innate sense for the physics of the work, this provides a great way to start thinking about operating system design. Are we creating the environments where we can apply the right types of interactions to the task at hand? And what are the minimal things that I might do to be able to encourage that? I hear a lot of companies in my research saying, well, when things were in person, it kind of worked, but now we need to heavily transactionalize everything in order to be more, to work remotely. The lesson that I give people there is do not attempt to replicate what worked in the office, but think of the principles that were involved that made that work. So this is an example of a big physical board. Why did this board work? It worked because of ritual. It worked because of accessibility. It worked because people had conversations in front of this particular board. It worked because it didn't force teams to put everything in a box. You see that there's just there's pink tickets to the left, there's big tickets to the right. You weren't forced in by some technical system to just categorize everything and processify everything. The areas of tension are highly visible. Look in the lower left, there's an area where there's a bunch of one-pagers all stacked up. It's very visible that there's an issue there that needs to be addressed. So thinking about how, with that in mind, if you were to think about attempting to replicate this in a remote environment, the worst thing you could do is to just kind of magically think you're going to create a big physical board in Miro and you're going to simulate all the things. But if you think about the principles, the ritual, visualizing areas that you need to talk about, when to have these conversations, it's super powerful. The final one I would say, that where can you start, is I love this. I've been talking about this image a lot where I'll do these meetings with teams and, you know, the design team is talking about journeys, the architecture, you know, the platform team is talking about team topologies, the architects are talking about event storming and event-driven design, the PMs are talking about jobs to be done, whoever. And someone is like, oh, we just agree on a simple framework that combines all these things. And then someone will say, well, that's what we tried in the past and it failed. So one of the things you can think about when you're designing operating systems is that the goal is not to come up with one model to rule them all. It's actually to come up with layers of models that work in contextual settings. Maybe the leader of the company wants a slide with 3 simple bullets to describe the strategy, but that doesn't mean that all layers of the company need to operate with a simple 3-bullet slide that has the strategy. So that's another lesson that you get when you see people who do this well. Above all, the key ingredient is intention. Ostensibly, the folks who are on this call are building products for the people out in the world. I'm amazed that some companies that spent an incredible amount of time of thoughtfulness and cognitive energy on the products that they deliver for the people out in the world spend a tiny fraction of that amount thinking about their ways of working as a product. So when you do these interviews, you hear people say things like, we treat this like a product. We treat this like a platform. Leadership is a platform. That's a fascinating concept. It starts with thinking, being intentional about the interactions we want. So whether you're a company that writes everything down or a company that wouldn't be caught dead writing anything down because it will somehow steal the mojo of the idea, it's really at the core about intentionality, and that's a common pattern. I'll leave you with one story to think about. There is a leadership team in Europe. The leadership team of this company all decided to do a sociology course. And I love this story. And they said, well, because at first I said, well, what do you use for goals? They said, we don't do goals here. Oh, that's interesting. Tell me about it. And they took an adventure as a leadership team. You know, we're going to step outside. We think about humans as machines here. We need to step out of our view and start thinking about our company as a culture, our company as a group of humans. And they were intentional and self-aware enough to know that they had been thinking themselves into a certain mental model. And they went out and took this course at a Northern European college or university on a sociology course. They got out of that course and they decided they didn't need anything. We don't have goals. We don't do this. We don't do OKRs. We don't do anything because they realized to get the consistency and drive they hope for in the company and the passion, they didn't need all those other things. I'll end with the funny point is they say it's great, except they have really trouble hiring anyone from the outside to be successful. And all the new leaders that try to join the company have such a hard time figuring out how crazy they are that they can't hire anyone from the outside at the moment. So I think that's kind of funny, a weird way to end this. So thank you. I'm not sure if we have time for questions or if that's in the cards, but I can hang out somewhere or people can reach out with questions if that's helpful to them.
Cool. Thank you so much, John.
Yeah,
we'll have time for a few questions. So let's take them in order of upvotes. And we have the first question, which I think you started answering very much in the last couple of slides. Based on your extensive interviews, are there any commonalities or patterns among top performing companies in their OS?
Yeah. The big thing, like I said, is this intention. It doesn't matter. Like if your intention is a low process culture, then just do it. If your intention is to be a write it down culture, do it. And that seems to be one of the key things, which is what I call like committing to the bit. Like if you're in a comedy show, you commit to the bit. You have to go in, you have to go all into what you're doing. So I think that that's one, the intentionality. The second thing is someone somewhere in the company is able to do this level of systems thinking. If it's the founder, great. You know, it's great that they love doing that. If it's not, one of the anti-patterns is basically when leaders who can't do this aren't really willing to admit they aren't good at it. And so they offload it to an operations person and just say, I don't want to deal with any of this process stuff. That sucks. I need you to go off and do it. Figure out OKRs for us. Figure out the process stuff because I don't want to be associated with that. And then when things fail, they blame it on that person. And it's terrible. Like the leader needs to, at least at a minimum, be self-aware enough to know that that's not their thing and empower someone who has this reasonable set of skills, whether that's the VPs that work for them, but maybe they're not good at it either. You have to have someone who's empowered, but the leader needs to stand by it. It can't be something just the operations people do and the leader just is a customer of it and complains about. That's an anti-pattern. So they do the reverse of that. Is a good tip.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And indeed, I think consistency starts from who do you hire, how do you manage people, everything else. And then the opposite of that is the boss went to a conference, came with this new idea, and suddenly we're kind of coming back to
what happens with a lot of the developer productivity stuff. It's like some passionate change agent from a developer experience team is the one who's like read all the books and knows all about it. And it's this passionate frontline change agent. And yet for the leader, it's a little bit like, oh yeah, I guess it's helpful. Like they haven't really gotten the leader to participate in part of the cultural aspects of what they're doing. And so it's always like, but I'm not seeing it at the right level. I'm not seeing it. I don't know what's going on. So you're going to get that kind of wishy-washiness unless you try to figure out how to really reinforce it with some leader messages. It's going to be difficult.
That makes sense. All right. I think we're at the end of the time box. Thank you so much, John. Next up.
My pleasure. Yeah.
Next up, we're welcoming Nathan Harvey from Google Cloud's DORA team.